Eighth graders, how you doing? This is Mr. Garnett Cook. Hope you're all having a good week. We are fast coming to the end of the school year. So this is going to be the last week where I will actually be giving you sort of assigned work to do. What I'll do next week when we look at the war in Europe is I'm going to give you sort of a list of different resources that I'll provide through modules. Readings, videos, things that you can, on your own time, should it interest you, access to learn a little bit more about the war in Europe. Because we are coming to the end of the school year, and we're just not going to have time to do any more kind of in-depth study. So this week's going to be focusing on World War II and primarily World War II in the Pacific. And you'll see on this first slide here something that always makes your kids understand when we start talking about World War II, which is that World War II is really two wars. There was a war in Europe fought between 1939 and 1945. Then there was a war in the Pacific fought between 1941 and 1945. So two wars, some of the same players are involved in each war, but in many ways they're very different wars with different outcomes, and they ended on different days. Also something important to know. So we're talking about two wars, really, when we talk about World War II. Today we're going to be focusing on the war in the Pacific, and that was a war fought primarily between the United States and Japan. And I want to first get into some of the root causes for that. I want to start with a Japanese expansion in East and Southeast Asia in the 1920s and the 1930s. What you see on this map, the areas shaded in red, are areas that were controlled by Japan in 1942. And by 1942, the United States was in, well, they were at war with Japan and recognized Japan as really their number one competitor for control of the Pacific. And you can see in this map that Japan had built an extensive Western Pacific empire by 1942. And we're looking to essentially neutralize the United States as a potential competitor, essentially for Pacific supremacy. So I want to give you a quick background timeline of the war in the Pacific. And we want to go back to the early 1900s, because it's in the early 1900s where we start to see the rise of Japan as a major economic power, but military power especially. Japan really began to what is called modernize in the late 19th century. In other words, they shifted to modern industries. They were looking to be able to compete with the major Western powers such as Germany, France, England, and the United States as well. And a big part of that was building up their military. And so what you see between 1900 and 1930 is Japan is building a major military power, and they were growing their power in the Pacific specifically, and they were becoming the number one competitor to the United States for power in the Pacific. You probably remember learning from an earlier video or screencast that by the early 1900s, the United States had established itself as a Pacific power. Um, in the late 1930s, Japan begins to expand into other areas of Southeast Asia. The one that got the most international attention was Japan's invasion of China in 1937. And then as we got into the late 1930s and early 1940s, Japan would extend its reach farther into Southeast Asia, into what was then known as French Indochina, what we know today as Vietnam, which is right here. And Japan is potentially threatening this island nation right here, the Philippines. And the reason why this is significant is because in the late 1930s, the Philippines was a colony of the United States. And so the US saw Japan as directly threatening its resources and its influence in the Western Pacific. And so there are growing tensions leading into 1941. The United States does two things in 1941 that will have a huge impact on what comes later. The United States will move most of its Pacific naval fleet from San Diego, California to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. That's big move number one. Big move number two is the United States imposes what is called an embargo against Japan, a cutting off of resources, oil and gas being the biggest ones. And you use some logic here. If you want to operate a big military, you need oil and gas. And so the United States was trying to cut off Japan's access to those resources. One of the limitations Japan had as a growing power was that they did not have the ability to get these resources themselves. They did not have a large oil supply in Japan, so they needed to trade and to get other territories to access the raw materials they needed. This is what sets the stage for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was the main United States naval base by the fall of 1941. And Japan devised a really uh, daring attack on Pearl Harbor, the goal of which was to knock out the United States Pacific Fleet so that it would no longer be a threat to Japan's continuing expansion into Southeast Asia. This is a picture of Pearl Harbor here. This island here in the middle of the harbor is what is known as Ford Island. And it was around Ford Island, you can actually see it in this picture, where all of the big American battleships were moored in 1941. This is one of my favorite history pictures of all time. This is a picture taken from a Japanese fighter plane on December 7th, 1941, the day that Japan attacked Hawaii. And you can actually see some of the spray coming up from the ships here as they are under attack. It was a surprise attack. The United States did not see it coming. There's a whole story behind that. There are some people who believed at the time and still believe to this day that the United States knew more about the attack in advance than they let on. Um, these kinds of conspiracy theories have persisted and will continue to persist probably for years. But the history books will describe it as a surprise attack. They did not knock out the entire Pacific Fleet of the United States. They did take out or damage almost three-quarters of it. Now, the United States will recover and rebuild a lot of those ships within a year. The United States comes back very quickly from this attack. So this is, I said, was a view from a Japanese fighter plane. These are some pictures of headlines. December 8th, 1941. This was major international news, the bombing of Hawaii by Japan. So this is what's going to bring the United States into World War II, the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the United States is not involved in the war in Europe until after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. These are some cool propaganda posters. When the United States got into the war, they immediately used propaganda to try to influence people to either join the military, to give all they can to support industry as they're building the weapons of war. There is a major effort to mobilize the American public in support of the war effort against Japan. In the United States itself, there will be a swift and fierce backlash against the Japanese and Japanese American population. In fact, the culmination of that was the removal of about 120,000 Japanese and Japanese American people in the United States, forcing them out of their homes and their businesses and relocating them into concentration camps in the western part of the United States, where they lived for the rest of the war. That's a whole story that unfortunately we won't have time to get into, but if I remember next week, I'll provide you maybe a video that you can learn a little bit more about that part of the war history. The United States, over the course of the war in the Pacific, you can see these blue lines here, will seek to push the Japanese empire back toward Japan. So what you see with this red line here is the farthest extent of Japanese expansion before and during World War II. And the goal of the war in the Pacific from the United States perspective was to push Japan back, territory by territory, island by island, ship by ship, until they've pushed them all the way back to mainland Japan. This will require some of the fiercest, bloodiest, most awful fighting of the war. You'll learn a little bit about that through some of the assignments that I'll give you this week. The war in the Pacific was just an awful, bloody mess. And it was a war that slowly, over the course of 3 years, the United States will win. By 1945, the United States will have pushed Japan back very close to mainland Japan. They will have taken much of Japan's Pacific territories away from them. The United States, during the war in the Pacific, was secretly building in the United States the very first nuclear weapon. And so during World War II, the United States initiated what is called the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project was the project whose goal was to develop the first nuclear weapons. And what you see here is a picture of what was known as the gadget. This was the first nuclear device ever tested in the world. In 1945, in July of 1945, the United States would test this gadget, and this is a picture of the explosion that this gadget produced. This is the first nuclear explosion in the history of the world. It was taken in New Mexico in July of 1945. And when this test was done, the United States officially became the world's first nuclear power. The United States will use two nuclear weapons, known as atomic bombs, on two Japanese cities at the end of World War II. One on August 6th was used on the city of Hiroshima, Japan. This is a picture of that city after the atomic bomb. The bomb destroyed about 80% of the city. It was caused about 70,000 lives, I believe, almost instantly when the bomb exploded. And this is a picture of Nagasaki, Japan, 3 days later, August 9th, 1945, when the United States destroyed about two-thirds of that city with the second atomic bomb. It would be 6 days after the second atomic bomb when Japan would formally surrender to the United States, ending the war in the Pacific. These bombs did tremendous damage, not just to buildings, but left people permanently disfigured. And one of the things that will come out over the course of time after World War II is the short and long term effects of the use of these bombs, both in terms of the injuries people sustained from the bombing itself, but also the lingering effects of nuclear radiation that caused illnesses in Japanese people for years after the bombs were used. And it was really a recognition of just how awful these weapons actually were. Some of the people who were involved in the creation of these nuclear weapons would later regret having participated in it. Here's a picture, New York Times headline, the atomic bombing of Japan. This again will bring about the war in the Pacific. The actual surrender would be signed in September of 1945, and that would officially end not only the war in the Pacific, but the war itself, all overall, in World War II will officially come to an end. So that's that's as fast a quick overview of World War II in the Pacific as I can give you in a screencast. Some of the assignments I'll give you this week will allow you to dive into the war in a little bit more detail. You can learn a little bit more about the rise of Japan as a major world power. I've got some resources that you can use to learn a little bit more about the war itself. So this will be the last formal week of sort of assignments. Next week we'll do a little wrap up. I'll provide you some resources on the war in Europe. And that will basically be the end of the year. Anyway, I hope you have a good week, folks.